Hello, welcome to this video. So, in this video, we are going to talk about private IP, public IP and elastic IP in AWS. If you know nothing about networking or if you have just a basic knowledge of networking, you need to know the difference between these different IPs. But if you already know about these IPs, you can skip this video. So, I am going to create an EC2 instance and I will describe the difference between these three IPs one by one. So, let us go to the console and create an EC2 instance. So, I am in my AWS console and I am going to the EC2 instance and I am going to create one EC2 instance. I am going to create one Amazon AMI instance and T2 micro. Network I will keep same, storage same, security group I am going to use the existing one which has 22 port open. Launch, I am going to choose the existing key pair. So, the instance is being created. So, while the instance is being created, let me define what these IPs are. So, the private IP is accessible only within your VCN because it is not exposed to internet and you are not able to access your EC2 instance using a private IP. Public IP is public and using this public IP you are able to access your EC2 instance. So, the public IP is accessible from internet. The elastic IP is also a public IP, but it is persistent across the EC2 instance reboots. So, we will see what is the difference between public IP and elastic IP while we are doing this demo. Okay. So, my EC2 instance is up and running. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have a private IP, we have a public IP assigned for this EC2 instance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the private IP is not accessible from internet. So, I am going to take the private IP and I am trying to access this private IP from the internet. So, I am going to take a console and I am outside the AWS cloud and I am trying to access the private IP assigned to this EC2 instance. So, I copied my private IP EC2 instance. So, there is a key available. This is my private IP. So, when I try to access the EC2 instance using private IP, I will not be able to access because the IP is not accessible from internet. So, I am going to cancel this. And this time I am going to access the EC2 instance using a public IP. So, I am copying my public IP. I am going to use the same syntax, but this time I am going to use the public IP. Okay. So, now I am able to log into the EC2 instance using a public IP. Now, let me go to the console and define the elastic IP. But before I define the elastic IP, let me restart my EC2 instance and see what happens to my public IP. Please note this public IP which is 54.159.203.46, that is the public IP assigned to my EC2 instance. So, I am going to restart, stop the instance. Now, see what happened if the instance is stopped. Now my instance is in stopped state and the public IP is removed from this instance. But if you see the private IP, the private IP still remains with the EC2 instance. So whenever you shut down any EC2 instance, if you have a public IP assigned to that EC2 instance, it will be removed. But when you restart that EC2 instance, it will assign a new IP address, new public IP address for that instance. Okay, but private IP, it remains constant throughout the EC2 instance life cycle. Now I am going to start the EC2 instance and see what happens to the public IP. Okay. Now my instance is up and running. Now if you see here, this time I got a different public IP. This is not same as what I have earlier. Now let me try to access with this public IP. Okay, you can check that this IP is different from the previous IP. Okay, now I am able to log into my EC2 instance successfully. So each time when an EC2 instance is restarted, it is getting a new public IP address. Instead, if you would like to keep the public IP address constant, you need to have an elastic IP provided by Amazon. So to have an elastic IP, if you come to the left hand side, you will see an option here, elastic IP, in the section networking. So I am going to create an elastic IP and I am going to use that elastic IP for my EC2 instance. Okay. Now in this home page, I am going to click on allocate elastic IP. So region is same, allocate. Now one elastic IP is allocated. Now I am going to associate this elastic IP to my EC2 instance. So this is my running instance. So you can even specify the public IP, private IP of that EC2 instance to associate with the elastic IP. So here I specified the instance ID, but if you are not sure what the instance ID is, you can specify the public IP address to associate with the elastic IP. Okay. Now I am going to associate this. Okay, this is successful. Now let me go back to the EC2 instance. Now if you see here, I got a new public IP which is same as the elastic IP. Okay, so the elastic IP is same as the public IP. But if you remember, after restarting, I got a different public IP. But when I reassign the elastic IP to this machine, the public IP is overridden by the elastic IP assigned to this EC2 machine. Okay. Now let me access this machine using this elastic IP. Okay, somehow I logged out of this machine. Okay, now this time I am going to use this IP. So, this is my ElasticIP. Okay. Now, I am able to log into this EC2 machine using my ElasticIP. Okay. So, now let me restart my machine and see if this ElasticIP persists across the reboot of this machine. I am going to restart this machine now. Stop. Okay. Now, my instance is stop, and if you see here the public IP, it still remained with this EC2 instance, and the elastic IP is also still available with EC2 instance, and the private IP, it still remains the same as when it was created. So, now let me start the instance and see if this instance has the same public IP, which is my elastic IP. So, my instance is up and running. Now, if you see, the public IP and the elastic IP is same, and the public IP did not change. So, in this demo we have seen three IPs: private IP, public IP and elastic IP. So, private IP, it is only accessible within your VCN in Amazon. It is not accessible in internet. The public IP is accessible in internet, but whenever you restart your EC2 machine, it will be released and reassigned, and it will get a new public IP. But if you assign an elastic IP to an EC2 instance, it is persistent across node reboots. So, the public IP remains same as long as the elastic IP is associated with its EC2 instance. Hope this gives some understanding and difference between these three different types of IPs. Now, before I stop this video, I have to make one more statement that whenever an elastic IP is associated with the EC2 instance, it is not charged. But if you want to release this IP, the elastic IP, and is not associated with any EC2 instance, you will be billed for the elastic IP. So, if you are practicing, it is always suggested to deassociate this elastic IP from EC2 machine and also remove it from the elastic IPs. So, I am going to do that now. Associate elastic IP, and release this elastic IP. Okay. Now, if you go to the elastic IP home page, you will not see any elastic IP. So, remember, after completing this demo, and if you are not using this elastic IP, you deassociate this elastic IP from the EC2 instance and also release that elastic IP from the AWS console. Hope this gives some understanding of these three different types of IPs. So, if you did not subscribe my channel, please subscribe it for any future updates. Thanks for watching this video.